Well, I have joining me now Dr. Kari Odermann, who is a global affairs analyst. She joins me from Cairo, Egypt this time. Let's focus on the Trump-Putin meeting, a failure or progress. She will give her 2 cents on the top stories from the very anticipated meeting, of course. Good to have you this lovely evening. We have the details from that meeting. Let's take it one at a time. No deal until there's a deal, and that's according to Trump. Does the outlook show that the U.S. has, leverage over Russia here?
I think we need to define who the U.S. is in this situation. Whether or not Donald Trump has leverage and wants to use leverage over Putin is an interesting question. He's always shown great personal affinity towards Vladimir Putin. However, we can't forget that there are these secondary sanctions that could readily be used. He did start the day off trying to impress Vladimir Putin. We can't forget that having a very rare B-52 flyover and other flights was something that cost between 2 and 3 million, a flyover like that. And he was willing to invest that to impress Putin. But as you said about me giving my 2 cents, it doesn't look like Trump was willing to give a dime to push for harder peace regulations and a ceasefire.
Right. So from your analysis, that seems like a waste of resources and time. But it was a private meeting and there was a press conference, but no questions, no documents, no real details of that meeting came out. What can we, take from the optics of that meeting?
Well, I think we need to reframe how we're looking at the meeting. It's been well reported that it was a waste of time and resources. But I think that's also a very comfortable narrative that we're used to when we're watching the new and at sometimes shocking way US President Trump does diplomacy. To say that it was all waste of time and he's coming out behind would really cater to that narrative. This is also being billed as a huge success by Vladimir Putin for his international standing. And also we have to understand domestically, he's going to package this as a success. But we have to really look at the disconnect between these narratives and the facts. And Russia's running out of money. And you don't come to a negotiation table or a summit to talk about stopping a war unless you have to. And Putin did show up. He did get the red carpet treatment. He did get his picture with Trump, but he also left abruptly. And that's something that's not being covered probably as widely as it should. Now, of course, Trump came out and billed the summit as a success. But I think we need to look deeper at the symbolism of things that happened at the summit.
Right. Now, for lack of better words, do you think this is rather an embarrassing moment for Trump? That's a lot of, what is out there in the public eye. He is, he's time and time again referred to as a deal breaker, as a businessman, but that is the opposite of what has happened, according to, reports. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of those.
Well, he wrote the book, The Art of the Deal, and I think the Alaska summit could be wrapped up as no deal, no meal, with the Putin delegation leaving before the luncheon even started, which is considered a diplomatic faux pas, not being able to break bread after a summit. Even though Donald Trump has been known to leave international summits early and skip the meal, in a bilateral situation, this is very interesting. Is it embarrassing? You have to look at what President Trump has been accused of in the past and his personal perception of what's embarrassing and what's not embarrassing. Of course, in a situation like this, he is the sole representative of the United States. And in a bilateral meeting, of course, he has a lot of responsibility. As you mentioned, he has billed the summit as successful. And he has handed off some of the responsibility to President Zelensky. But I wouldn't say that this is necessarily embarrassing. The Kyiv Post, a newspaper based in Ukraine, has just published an article about how Melania Trump wrote a personal letter about the Ukrainian children that are in Russian captivity. And President Trump handed that to Putin at the summit, which is an interesting point.
That's quite interesting. Now, Trump also says no sanctions on Russia for now. Isn't that a win for Putin, so to speak? We're talking about the person who started the war here. What did Trump get Putin to agree to, I mean, for him to have held off on the sanctions for now from, Russia? Because that's the only way Russia could have maybe or possibly agreed to a ceasefire.
It does look like a win on the surface in the sense that Putin is walking away from the Alaska summit with no new sanctions, no repercussions, and he's able to buy himself some time. But as I had mentioned, I think we need to look at this as what does he need to buy himself time for? And why was he willing to come to the negotiation table? And why did he leave so quickly? And it's simply because he went in with a set of expectations that weren't met. And he withdrew himself from the situation. He got what he needed for the domestic audience. But what happens next, I think, is really going to be decided on Monday.
Right. Now, explain to us, Carrie, let's not pretend as if the EU is not here. How's the EU, become almost irrelevant without the US? A lot of people are blaming Trump, but the issue is that the EU has its role to play here and it hasn't. A comment, got me today, which says the EU is currently discussions. But let's have you, I could not help that, comments, out there on social media, but how has the EU, played its role? It's almost irrelevant in these conversations.
I think they're trying to be relevant, and I think it's a misconception that it's only about discussions. They have to build consensus between 27 member states, and that's hard work. And that's where this idea that they're only talking comes from. They also have a lot of things going on in the background. There are discussions of military conscription. And of course, the EU and NATO have both had very relevant budgetary discussions in the past 6 months, where they're going to be NATO countries and the EU are talking about investing up to 5% of their GDP on military equipment, combat readiness. There are two issues where I think the EU is really dropping the ball here. And there's about 2 billion euros in Russian assets that are frozen now in European banks, particularly one in Brussels. And the interest on this money is being used to fund some reconstruction efforts and defense efforts for Ukraine. But wars start on the battlefield, they end at the bank. And if these assets were frozen, there would be Putin would be much more eager to negotiate. And the second point that I want to mention about disappointing inaction, but this isn't only for Europe. Also, there are many North American companies that are making huge profits in the Russian market right now. And I'm not talking about medicine or baby food. I'm talking about shampoo and snack makers. We're talking about Oreo, Oreo maker Mondelez. We're talking about Nestle. We're talking about Mars and Pepsi and Coca-Cola that are basically enjoying peace in their headquarters in North America and in Europe. They're making money. They're paying profit taxes in Russia, which is going directly to fund the war that EU countries and Canada and the US are trying to stop.
No. I'll bring your attention to something Putin, just recently said, and that just a few minutes ago, about the fact that besides the Ukraine war, there were other conversations that were had with Trump. Trump is a businessman, and one begins to wonder, was he really, fighting for Ukraine to see the survival of, people? We know that he's a humanitarian, but then for Putin to admit to the fact that there were other conversations and the fact that this was a private conversation, that raises a lot of dust here.
The fact that it was a private conversation and business was alluded to, I think is a technique that is very familiar when you talk with Vladimir Putin. Steve Witkoff, who has spoken with Putin several times, his personal affinities, his faith has been used as leverage in these meetings. It's no surprise that Putin would try to cloud the waters of the difference between Trump as a businessman and Trump as the embodiment of the U.S. And the elected representative of the people of the United States. Trump has clouded the waters himself also, but that Putin would try to do this is not a surprise.
Right. Now, I'll bring you to this as well. Talking about the sanctions right there, what would have made Trump to cool off on sanctions on Ukraine from that meeting?
I don't think that Putin came to Alaska because he was really afraid of direct sanctions, because those were things that could have been implemented months and years ago by Trump. I think his key concern is really the secondary sanctions. And what Putin would have had to have done to avoid any type of sanctions or repercussions and have really walked out of there with a white vest is, I guess opinions differ. Trump would like this to end quickly, and he seems to be less concerned about the details. For the Ukrainians, I think they want their borders back from 1991.
Finally, before I let you go, Trump says this is all up to Zelensky, and it sounds to a lot of people like he's going to push the ideas from that meeting to Zelensky, and if Zelensky says no, and then the ball lies in his court, and it might seem at the end of the day as if it's Zelensky's fault.
Well, I think you make a very valid point here, and I've got a few burning questions about what's going to happen on Monday in the White House. First of all, what's Zelensky going to wear? Second, is there any new information that Trump will be giving Zelensky that he learned directly from Putin? And you have to ask yourself, is it a bad thing if the United States is not involved, especially if Donald Trump is not involved in this discussion? Because patterns have indicated that he disregards certain formats and protocol that make negotiations more predictable. And by not having Trump involved, there would probably be more stability and respect for things like national sovereignty or international law, some of the basic founding principles of the modern nation state. So yes, to use an American expression, Trump is passing the buck a little bit, but he's also pushing the responsibility onto Zelensky where it belongs. And I think having agency is what Ukrainians prefer, rather than to have someone decide something over their heads.
Right. Interesting point of view there. Dr. Carrie Odermann joined us from Cairo, Egypt, to talk about the Zelensky, meeting on Monday, and of course the Putin-Trump, meeting overnight. Thank you so much for the time.